Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Earlier this week, the second and more severe batch of international sanctions was imposed on Iran by the U.S. administration, focusing on the Islamic Republic's oil and banking industries. During today's program, we will discuss the potential risks and benefits of the American measures in the face of Iranian resistance and international reluctance. To do so, I'm joined here in the studio by Mr. Meir Javedanfar, who is a Iran lecturer at IDC Herzliya. Welcome. I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Dr. Eldad Pardo, who's a research director at Impact SE and lecturer on Iran at the Hebrew University, Jerusalem. Welcome.
Nice being here.
Mr. Oren, give us a broader understanding of the latest developments pertaining to this subject.
Donald Trump has been elected president 2 years ago, and even during his presidential campaign and in the almost 2 years following that, he has taken head-on the Iranian regime. And he has made good on his pledge to take the United States out of the so-called Iranian nuclear deal and reimpose sanctions on the regime and its subsidiaries, mostly the Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force. However, once he has done that, it remains to be seen what impact we are going to see, because, first of all, there are waivers. 8 countries, 5 in Asia and 3 in Europe, and more specifically in the Mediterranean, have been granted waivers, at least temporarily, from the sanctions. And many companies, there are almost 900 entities which have been sanctioned in Iran, and many companies have stopped doing business with either the corporations or people involved with them. It is probably too soon to know whether the Iranian regime would be so strangled or starved, using the terms which Secretary of State Pompeo and others used, that it will come hat in hand to the Trump administration in order to renegotiate the deal. Because one should remember that the American aim is not to have a war with Iran. They also say that they don't want regime change, but obviously they will be satisfied if for some reason there is a revolution. But the declared aim is to renegotiate a better deal. Whether this will happen or not depends, of course, on both sides.
Mr. Javedanfar, while the Iranian regime has threatened to also pull back from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the technical term for the nuclear agreement, it has warned both the European Union and other countries that unless they can preserve the economic benefits of this agreement, there was nothing for Tehran to stay in this deal. What happened? They set the date of the 4th of November as the mark, which was the deadline for the Europeans as well, and they have not really stepped back of anything.
It's a very good point. Look, Iran has to be very pragmatic at this point. They try to be pragmatic on some accounts. They can't cut off the Europeans completely. But on the other hand, they recently did not pass the parliamentary resolution on FATF, which is the Financial Action Task Force, which means that Iran is not compliant now. Iran is not going to be compliant. So even if there are Europeans who want to deal with Iran, they're going to have to be very, very careful, because it's not just the European sanctions that they have to worry about. It's now also the FATF could go after them, because some of these banks are not going to be supervised. And I think that brings us to another point, which I think Iran is facing, its banking sector. I think this is a serious risk. I'm not sure that Iran will capitulate within the next 2 years. The amount of oil that will sell is going to be enough just to keep the economy going. And even though they probably won't be able to get the money back, they can do barter with other countries. But the banking sector, that's a black hole. That's a serious issue for the regime. We have to wait and see. I would say that's actually one of the issues that could trigger a panic between the public if one of the banks falls. I haven't seen any panic right now, even though the sanctions have been imposed and everything. I haven't seen any panic yet. But the banking issue, that's something that I'm going to be keeping a close eye on.
Dr. Paldo, we hear Iranian leaders in response to those sanctions, also leading up to the sanctions, trying to reassure the Iranian public with regard to the viability and ability of the Iranian regime to withstand the different challenges facing, still admitting to the challenges up ahead, that they are not going to be as easy to stand fast. But it seems like the Iranian public keeps to its position where, on the one hand, it's not happy with what's happening on the domestic front, but on the other hand, it does unify in the face of international challenges.
Well, basically, you're asking about regime change or a kind of a revolution. We know from past experience that these things cannot be predicted, and there are a lot of elements, mobilization and how people behave. The major question is that there is no trust in Iran for the government. I think one should judge things according to expectations and anticipations and understanding of the situation. If you think about Iran during the Iran-Iraq war, after the invasion, in the worst conditions, everybody went and tried to help, most of the people, let's say, tried to help and defend the country. But now there is no explanation. Why do they have to suffer? The government spends a lot of money for nothing, and they are in a very, very sensitive situation. Mm-hmm. Now, my understanding, if I try to read between the lines, is that Iran really is interested in a deal, and they are gradually changing the strategy. You listen from Khamenei, he says, all the world supports us and is against the United States, meaning that you have to change the position of the United States. Why change the position for the United States to negotiate? Zarif said, and I read it in the Iranian press, well, if the Trump administration, if they change the policy, we can negotiate with them. He also stressed, Khamenei, that he's not going for a war, and so on and so forth. Also, when it comes to the Middle East, they speak more about economic involvement and less about, in reality, they are everywhere. They are still spending the money. But there are also signs that, for example, an organization such as Hezbollah understand that there is going to be problems with money flow from Iran, and maybe whether this regime will survive or not. So I would guess that they will try to reach some kind of a deal, but it's going to be very tough because Trump is, he's a New York contractor. He's not going to, he's going to ask for something.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Oren?
2 points. First, regarding what Meir said about barter. Of course, the Iranians are trying to find some device by which they can get what is owed to them in accounts abroad, and they will have a similar account set up for whatever they are going to sell, so that money doesn't have to change hands. It doesn't have to go through the international banking system. And we know it even here in Jerusalem, when you have people whose profession is changing currency, that this is how it is done when someone doesn't want money traced. Mm-hmm. So there are people in Israel and elsewhere who are watching the possibility that this will be a sort of a bypass.
Nevertheless, when we're looking at the economic sectors, both in the European Union with Federica Mogherini, the foreign policy chief, trying as much as possible to establish different mechanisms that will bypass the American sanctions, as you say, but the European businesses are not responsive to those threats by the European Union. Neither are the Chinese companies by the threats of the Chinese government. Everybody realizes that it's better to do business with the United States than Iran.
Yes, but the timetables are not synchronized. The Iranian view of the urgency of what they have to do is different than the American one. The Iranians see themselves as an ancient empire. They have withstood many pressures for thousands of years, so they will try to wait several more months before they have to give up. Of course, if you do it in a sort of simulation, in a laboratory, in a computer, you would say that they have no choice, that their options are very limited, and that they have to give up. But they don't see it this way. Now, the problem with the nuclear deal was that it was only nuclear. It had nothing to do with the ballistic missiles and the so-called malign activities in the region. The problem from the point of view of Trump and others, including Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. But we have yet to see whether there is any impact on the war in Yemen, where the Americans have given notice to the Saudis and the Emirates to change the way they conduct the war there because of the criticism. We have to see whether Hezbollah is really constrained, and yes, there are indications that it will get only half the amount of support it has gotten so far, so it will have an impact. And most importantly now, what is going to happen in Iraq? Because Iraq, if you take all the issues in order of priorities, the Iraqi or the control of Iraq is most important to the Quds Force, to Qassam Soleimani, and there are no indications yet of pressure being brought to bear on Iran.
Mr. Javedanfar, when we're talking about the Iranians' ability to continue to sell all oil, not only to the 8 nations, but to other nations, it's ongoing challenges on the economic front, as you stated earlier, that it will have enough just to come by on a regular economic basis. Do you believe that this will force them to scale back from their operations around the region? We are about Hezbollah only receiving probably in the near future half of its previous Iranian support. What's happening there?
I think, well, when I said Iran's got enough, I think in the short term, probably within the next 2 years, they will be looking for, they'll be watching very closely what happens in U.S. presidential elections in 2020. Look, in terms of how much support they give to Bashar al-Assad and Hezbollah, I think they will continue with what they have. But will it mean they're going to change? No, because Iran needs Hezbollah. Iran sees Hezbollah right now as a very important pillar of the war in Syria. It sees it as a deterrence against the state of Israel. And to be honest, it doesn't, the expenses, I'm not sure what's the exact number in terms of support. I've heard 200 million, I've heard 800 million, I've heard 2 billion. We don't know. Apparently it's being taken by cash anyway, a lot of these cases.
It's between $600 and $800 million, which is about 2/3 of the $1.2 billion budget that Hezbollah has annually.
Okay, so that's not too much for Iran when the budget last year was more than $300 billion. That's 1/300. It's 1.3%. So, but
you know, in every budgetary debate, it's the margins which are being fought over. After you allot the money to certain users, you fight over the last billion.
But that's not issue for debate in Iran. That's not even included in the official budget. That's the supreme leader puts that. It's not I'm trying to think about the answer. It's a very difficult question you've asked. On the one hand, Iran could become even more aggressive. There were reports that there was a very sophisticated cyber attack against Iran a couple of, almost a week ago. On the other hand, Iran cannot isolate itself more in the region. I think it's a very difficult question for me to answer. I'm going to have to go with, say, in the short to medium term, at least by 2020, Iran's not going to change much in the region.
Dr. Paldo, would you agree?
No, I don't. I think, of course, nobody can tell the future, but I think we have to look at the larger picture. The larger picture from Iranian point of view or from Khamenei's point of view is to keep the revolution and transfer it to the next generation. And I don't think he wishes to be remembered as the one who destroyed the revolution. So he must look for some kind of an interim agreement that will keep the regime. and then hope to appoint people that will continue the march towards conquering the world, maybe 15 years down the road, 10 years down the road, or whatever.
The world? Iran conquering the world?
His title is Vali Amre Musulmanane Jahan. He is the leader of all the Muslims of the world and all the mustazafin, all the downtrodden. So there is in Iran, within the regime, a mystical dimension and some childish belief that they are going to bring the Mahdi. People ignore this, but this is the essence. Why do they lie? Why do they need the nuclear weapons? Why do they do all these irrational things when they could be much wealthier and happier and still authoritarian? No, they have this ideological. Khamenei works with Khomeini since he was almost a child. It's from the early 60s, I think.
But do you think Iran will change its policies in the region?
They will change everything on the tactical. When you have strong, even if you take people like Shamir in Israel in the past, people who are very, very ideologically committed, and I think Netanyahu is also like that. They will compromise, they will lie, they will do all the tricks. Why? Because they have a higher truth. And for the higher truth, and then you say, he's a liar, no, he's not a liar, he's a liar for the cause. This is how I see it. They have a cause. We don't believe in the cause. We say that they are corrupt, that they steal money and all that. Fine, but that's true. But
so does this mean when U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo came out and announced the reimposition of the sanctions, he did not specifically demand a shift? Of course, he requested a shift in Iran's conduct, but he demanded an end to the revolutionary activities. Does that have to do with this specifically?
They can suspend it. They can wait until the right moment.
I don't think that's going to happen.
But if you look at it from the American point of view, I'm listening to Brian Hook, and he said we have two goals. One goal is that they will have less cash, and then that we can reach a deal, not regime change, nothing of that sort. What I think is that if you look realistically, the United States is still within the nuclear deal, even though they announced that they left it, because everybody else is there, and they want to improve it. What does it mean in reality? That instead of doing the negotiations 8 years down the road, they start the negotiation of the next deal now, because they believe that they can get better results, and also for Trump is great for his policy. So they said, okay, you think Iran that will negotiate with you when you are rich, when you have almost having the bomb, when you control the Middle East, then we start the negotiations. No, we start now. And that's it. It's the negotiation of the next stage of the nuclear deal now.
I want to hear Mr. Javedanfar's response.
To expect the supreme leader of Iran to stop being revolutionary is like to expect the prime minister of Israel to stop being a Zionist. It's not going to happen. Revolution doesn't mean setting off suicide bomb. No, revolutionary means challenging the United States, the global arrogance, istikbar jahani, by rhetoric first and foremost, and where possible, where the Americans create the right conditions in the region. I don't think that's going to happen. They could tamper it down, but this is one of the fundamental issues of Iran, because some people say, look, it's 40 years has gone by. We tried to challenge America. What did we gain from it? But there are others who say, look, today America has left Iraq. Today America is having severe problems in Afghanistan. We are the ones who did it. So the revolution, and look at where we are. We are in Syria. We are in Yemen. Where were we during the 8 years war with Iraq? We couldn't even reach Basra.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Oren?
The paramount paradigm of American foreign policy after Second World War is containment. And it worked vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. They contained communism. They didn't have to roll back communism because it imploded from within. And they believed that what was so successful with communism will work with Khomeinism. And for that, all they have to do is wait for the regime to find the self-contradictions in its policy, and they have to wait for an Iranian Gorbachev. Now, whether this is realistic or not, whether it's simplistic, of course, we have to see whether the so-called moderate wing headed by Rouhani and with Zarif, can they really win over Qassem Soleimani of the Quds Force and others in the favors of Khamenei? Now, there are views outside Iran that these differences are minor, that both Rouhani and Soleimani are really expressions of Khamenei, and the differences are really tactical. But dynamics sometimes take place and things change, even though right now they don't seem to.
Mr. Javedanfar?
I think Trump and others want regime change. I think the example they look at is the US-Soviet relationship. The détente in 1972, 1973 between Brezhnev and Nixon, which was supposed to, create, to reduce conflict. And all of a sudden they saw that the ink hadn't been dried, and all of a sudden the Soviets were supporting the Arabs in the war against the state of Israel, and also the Soviets continued with those. So what was the conclusion in America? Of course, let's not forget Afghanistan. The conclusion was, with such regimes you cannot reach a deal. So they went for the overthrow of the Soviet regime. This seems to be the belief in the Trump administration today. Obama tried to reach a détente with the Iranian regime. What did we see?
Nevertheless, it's very interesting what Dr. Pardo stated with regard to starting negotiations early. When we're talking about putting Iran to the specific positioning in which it's under extreme pressure, not only because of its failing economy, but also because of the drought and different elements of power challenging between the Iranian army and the Revolutionary Guard, and different animosities materializing from within. And don't forget that Khamenei is also very sick. Nobody knows how long he has left to live. To what degree does the Trump administration believe, or the United States believe, that right now is the time to start those negotiations if the Iranians survive those several years until we reach that point where they will be ready to start negotiating? Great. If they don't survive, regime change.
I try not to sound too sure about when I talk about Iran, because it's very difficult, okay?
Yeah.
But one thing I'm more sure than others, even if you reach a deal with the Islamic Republic of Iran regarding issues such as Syria, that doesn't mean that it's the end of it. They will find, if there's another opportunity in the future, they will take it, just like the Soviets took it after Dayton. The Islamic Republic, the Velayat al-Faqih system cannot function without the Revolutionary Guard. And how do you feed the Revolutionary Guard? By being revolutionary, which gives them economic interests, gives them political interests. The regime cannot survive without it. So it may be a tactical, a hudna, you want to call it, or what do you call it in Arabic? That a hudna, temporary. But this is the fundamental problem with allow me to generalize. This is the fundamental problem which the Iranian population has with this regime. Look, the Shah almost decapitated Iraq. He almost took off Kurdistan. The Shah some people believe that one of the reasons why the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979 was because the Shah had so aggressively from 1974 with the former Afghan leader Dawood had gone after the communists in order to turn Afghanistan away. The Shah also did these things, but people didn't complain that much. But today, this whole issue of being revolutionary is a central theme, and I don't think it's up for negotiations inside Iran.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Of course, that's the situation. That's why one needs a huge pressure. It's not easy because we have here a mix with the Revolutionary Guard and also the religious strata. That the ideology and the benefits and the perks, they all stream together, and it's very easy for them. But in the end of the day, they will have to choose. That's why the pressure.
Mr. Oren?
There are two possible routes to regime change. One is a palace coup around Khamenei, or once he dies and there is a struggle for leadership. And the other is a counter-revolutionary mass movement in the streets, workers, students, and everybody. The professional view of those who follow the security mechanisms in Iran is that the revolutionary regime has managed to bolster itself with various belts and rings around it of revolutionary guards and Basij and many other intelligence and security agencies, and it is not feasible right now to expect it to be toppled.
Well, we're drawing near to the end of the program, so I'd like to give each and every one of you the opportunity to have a closing statement. Mr. Javedanfar, we'll start with you.
I'm not so sure that we're going to see regime change anytime soon, but I'm not so sure that Iran will be able to manage the sanctions in the long run. In the short time they can do it. What I think is a serious problem for Iran. It has made compromise for itself very difficult. And the same for Trump. Trump has also, the position he's created has made compromise regarding his position very difficult. We are entering uncharted territory here. I think we face some very unstable times ahead.
Dr. Pardo?
I think we should not overlook the mystical, irrational dimension. Even though there is the pragmatical side, Iran can collapse in a minute if there is a kind of a feeling that, this is what destiny decides. They can change policy. There could be surprises.
Mr. Oren?
Perhaps the biggest paradox here is how are you going to measure success and whether success will lead to failure. If the Iranian regime is desperate, and this is following on what Eldad just said. If it is desperate, does it mean that it gives up, or conversely, that it breaks out, trying some adventure, whether in Iraq or Yemen or in Lebanon, does something out of the ordinary, launches missiles at Israel in order to provoke some conflagration, which will have to be settled by the United Nations and others. So getting the regimes back to the wall may backfire.
And Israel, to what degree will it get involved?
Well, Israel is watching what is happening in the nuclear field, but as was said here, there are no movements on the nuclear field. Everybody agrees that the Iranians adhered to the deal. As for other measures, Israel stands ready to strike if it has the right pretext.
Well, this is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank Mr. Javedanfar, Mr. Oren, and Dr. Pardo for coming here today. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.